Thank you, that's great. Greetings. Welcome to lecture number 3. Today we turn to the subject of history, or more precisely and explicitly, to the subject of time. If I move that, is that okay for your sound? Sound okay? I just moved that a little bit. Is it fine? Okay. So I need to say right at the beginning that I am not a historian, and I have great admiration for those of you who are, but I am not claiming to have the skills that a historian, such as many of you in this room, do have. And nor am I qualified to speak about the formal interactions between the disciplines of anthropology and history as they've been institutionally embedded. I'm thinking, for example, of the University of Michigan Anthropology and History program as a sort of prominent institutional base where students are trained in both anthropological methods and historical ones. Some anthropologists are precisely trained to work in the archives and in the methods of historiography. Some anthropologists have recently been speaking of their work as an ethnography of the archives, and I am not speaking about any of these matters, although all of these interactions are productive and profitable for our discipline. Rather than speaking about the formal or even the conceptual relation between the disciplines of anthropology and history, my comments today are offered in the spirit of Barney Cohn's famous book, An Anthropologist Amongst the Historians. And what I'm doing is thinking about anthropology in conversation with history in order to evoke different ways, I hope a couple of different ways, that we can think about and use history in anthropology. My intention is partly to support the relevance of history and to emphasize its importance in our discipline, and partly to consider not only the concept of time, but also the ways historical trajectories, let us call them cultural flows or cultural pasts, can be traced or tracked in a particular cultural milieu, and how they can be understood as constitutive of a contemporary landscape that we are researching in any given context at any given particular moment in time. So my discussion of history is not an archival one as such, as productive as this mode of research engagement may be. Nick Dirks is one of the people who started the University of Michigan Anthropology and History program, and a historian and anthropologist of India, who went on, as you can see, to write a book called The Autobiography of an Archive. I am interested instead, as I've indicated, in the ways we trace cultural flows, these cultural pasts, and understanding how we can use them to help us further appreciate the contemporary formations of social worlds. I'm talking about the social and the historical construction of the present. And in the spirit of the lecture series as a whole, I am more interested in the ways ideas have been transmitted and inherited, both in our disciplinary culture and in any given field, and the ways they come to be seen as natural. I quite like this image, although I also have some problems with it. But in one draft of this lecture, I talked a little bit about cultural DNA, wanting to kind of reappropriate biology from the biologists. And then I saw this image and thought, okay, we'll do that. But please understand, I am not advocating for a biological view of culture at all. This is an anti-essentialist slide in my rendering. So I'm interested in the ways ideas have been transmitted and inherited, and this is the point, that even culture can be transmitted and inherited, even if it's not essentially so, right? Both in our disciplinary culture and in any given field, which precisely because they come to be seen as natural, which is, of course, what this slide is also indicating, that the author of it, the artist, somehow sees a tree as natural. So, the schools of thought that influence one generation from another, the ways national or regional approaches to the discipline and its cognate fields have rounded out the edges of what we are looking for, what we find, and how we interpret those findings. By thinking about our field, and also thinking about culture in general, in these very wide strokes, my discussion, I appreciate, perhaps is unsatisfactorily broad, especially to a historian, those of you who are historians, who are trained to look for fine-grained detail. But I hasten to say this is intentional. I'm trying to see our field in broad brushstrokes, coarse textures, choosing the larger pattern at this juncture rather than fine-grained detail, so we can get a picture of the larger whole. There are other moments, like when we are conducting our ethnographies, or when we are embracing the historical details of particular case studies, that the details can come into play. That's my professional disclaimer. So my genealogy of our discipline, anthropology, told in terms of patterns and these broad brushstrokes, these histories of thought, sometimes even buying into the myths, as Professor Yavins called me out on last week, is not unlike the kind of genealogy I am suggesting is productive for the study of any culture, including, as I've said, our disciplinary culture, which is the one I'm trying to interrogate through these lectures. It is a genealogy, a history in the loose sense of the word, emphasizing lineage, emphasizing influence, allowing for multiplicity, allowing for myth, allowing for that which falls into and out of fashion, but hopefully coming to understand why and able to trace where the influences come from. By the way, there are the most beautiful images of genealogical trees on the internet. These are both from language and family names in particular. In parallel, I am advocating for the use of history and anthropology through the production of genealogies of symbolic meaning. And I am suggesting that anthropology can contribute to our knowledge of the historical developments of particular cultures or cultural flows through tracing those meanings and their representations at the individual and collective levels over time. I'm influenced in this undertaking, as are we all, by a historian who also knew how to speak to our discipline, who was instrumental in creating it, in fact, none other than the great Max Weber. And I note, by the way, that this phrase, influenced by, is the same phrase that Wikipedia uses when you look up some of these scholars, influenced by. And although I'm critical of Wikipedia's broad brushstrokes often enough, I actually think there's something productive of being able to trace these different lines of thought. So I admit that that's not Wikipedia as such, but I admit that that kind of broad influence is part of what I'm doing here with the genealogy of method. So since Weber's work, we can now ask in each particular context, what are the dominant flows of culture in a particular place at a particular time, and where do they hail from? From when, from where can they be charted? And those of you in the master class, consider this a little tutorial in Weber. Weber didn't put it quite like this. I am layering post-colonial developments in, but I also think that using the same tools he gave us, we can ask, what are the resistant flows of culture in a particular place at a particular time? We can consider all political levels, if you like. Where do majoritarian views come from? How do they dominate? How do minority, activist, resistance movements, in turn, respond? So what is the disciplinary milieu? What is the scene or the stage set into which Weber arrives? Over the past two lectures, I have been describing a disciplinary history, first through texts and then through ethnography, that was largely responsible for a comprehensive account of the world's primitive religions. Anthropologists and the discipline of anthropology were useful to comparative humanists and scientists, since they could help make the comparative project truly universal and the universalist project truly comparative. And they did so not only by adding to the questions of linguistic origins and to some degree biological origins, the question of cultural origins, but also by deploying the method of ethnography, as we've discussed, in such a way that they could add to the study of doctrinal, scriptural, and canonical religions in particular, freshly gathered data about oral traditions and mythologies, which had to be reckoned with as forms of religion in their own right. So enter into this turn-of-the-century intellectual conversation between early anthropologists, theologians, and philologists, another discipline and another way of thinking about religion and its relation to society, focusing not on the primitive experience, but on the civilizational one, history. Max Weber's capacity to think at the level of collective ideology and to trace its influences as well as its effects in thought and attendant behavior comparatively and over time changes the contours of the social sciences and the ways we understand the study of everything from society to culture to religion to economics. Now, I'm sure that many of you in this audience will be more familiar with the history of history in Germany in particular than I am, and I look forward to hearing a little bit more about it, because in the US, where I was trained, we are introduced to Weber via the translations largely of Talcott Parsons, the translations and interpretations of Talcott Parsons, who from the late 20s on establishes the mid-century Harvard School of Social Relations. So I'm already reading Weber through translation, and you will probably have a different national genealogy to share with me. A historian by training, as you know, Weber's methodological choice to trace cultural flows through their ideologies at the level of civilization and with an interest in diachronic change rather than synchronic description is a dramatic shift in what the comparative study of society is doing before the early 20th century. What Weber is able to achieve is a way of showing how a group of individuals' belief systems, not their cognitive structures, please note, that is, their worldviews, Weltanschauung, am I correct? Can, in ways that are not always straightforward, but that always, in the end, make sense if only we can figure out what the sense is, influence, not determine, please note, the way people behave. Little picture of Calvin there for you. And when people share a belief system, let us call it an ideology, and thus find themselves influenced in similar ways and behaving or acting in a mutually intelligible fashion, the social systems, that is, the institutions around them, respond accordingly, thus encouraging or discouraging certain kinds of further behavior or attendant action over time. There is nothing static about it. So in a nutshell, this is what I'm calling a cultural model of history, or a historical model of culture. This is what it looks like. A critical mass of people believing in a particular ideology or a soteriological or transcendental viewpoint tend to behave in ways that support that particular worldview, and then find that the institutions of their societies and communities operate in ways consistent with and even supportive of it. This interchange between worldviews and actions becomes a kind of organic cycle or dynamic flow where the way we think the world works perpetuates the working of the world in particular ways. What Weber is showing us is how people and their institutions mutually reinforce each other, as well as the worldviews that give rise to what is seen as appropriate action in the world, while also sustaining particular ideological viewpoints that may be theological or nationalistic or soteriological or whatever. Thus does he take theology, one form of a belief system, seriously, but he is not fixated on the texts as the end of the story. Indeed, they are the beginning of the story, as Weber interprets them. So what Weber is describing is social formation. Now I'm sure we're almost done with Weber, because I know you guys must get a lot of it, but I wanted to set the stage. What Weber is describing is social formation by accounting for how social and cultural worlds come into action through ideology. This is an inherently dynamic model. If what is around you is influencing your worldview, and the institutions of your society are built up to support a particular outlook on the world, that outlook itself is strengthened, but it is not fixed. A social system built up by individuals' viewpoints is fluid and interactive. Institutions are built by worldviews, but engaging with those institutions has the capacity to influence those worldviews. And worldviews can and do change as institutions change, and with new worldviews come new institutions, which produce new worldviews. There is always room for maneuver in this model. We are creating our systems, even as our systems are creating us. This awareness is the consciousness of history. Okay, so the second section of the paper is a case study, and it refers to some research I did, and it was published in a book a few years ago called The Spirits of Crossbones Graveyard. I think Roland very kindly showed you a picture of it in the first lecture, Time, Ritual, and Sexual Commerce in London. And I just want to give you a sense of how these rather highfalutin theoretical ideas can be played out in practice, or played out on the ground for an anthropologist. And so this section is called A Study in History and a Study in Myth. Tracing historical flux. It sounds a reasonable proposition, but how exactly do we go about mapping or delineating historical flows? Or more difficult, perhaps still, the ways those flows produce the contours of culture at any given moment in time. What do cultural traces look like? How do we name the ways a culture comes to look the way it does in a diachronic sense? Ethnography is wonderful, but in a way we're at the same methodological question we started with last week. What do you do when you get there? And ethnography is always only a snapshot or an extended set of snapshots in time. We cannot go backwards in time as ethnographers. The history of a place is not going to jump out and present itself to us explicitly as we're in the field or on the ground. So let me take you to this recent site of fieldwork, London. The ethnographic part of this project focused on a small group of ritualists who gather every 23rd of the month, I'm sure they were there last night, at 7 p.m. at a small patch of land near Southwark Cathedral to commemorate, as they call it, the spirits of the medieval sex workers who worked in this particular part of what is now London. From a 21st century viewpoint, the paradox that is at the heart of this ritual is as follows. The medieval sex workers, who are the objects of our commemoration, were tenants of the brothels who rented accommodation from land owned by the Christian Church. Southwark was the site of the London base of the Diocese of Winchester. So the Bishop of Winchester had his London residence in Southwark, and the Manor of Winchester was the major landholder in the area. This is I think, a Victorian map. And London and Westminster are on the north, but you can also see, I think, that the borough of Southwark, which is designated separately, is the smaller area to the south of the River Thames. The diocese rented out houses right on the river to brothel owners. Southwark, and the reason for this is that Southwark is close enough to London, but also far enough away, that it was collectively considered a good idea for sex work to take place just across the river. And in general, indeed, all kinds of somewhat desirable, but lowbrow activities were outsourced to Southwark. So over the course of the early modern period, you have bear pits, you have taverns, you have theaters, Shakespeare's Globe, which was not of the highbrow world then that it is perhaps now. And Southwark developed and maintains to this day a sense of productive, defiant, independent alterity. So you can kind of think about it in terms of, we are the underdog and we like it that way. And that, I would suggest, has continued for the last 800 years or so. Prostitution was in fact accepted in medieval France as well as medieval England, and it's a matter of some historical and feminist debate as to whether it was seen as degenerate a practice as it is now. There are some texts that imply that women had to be discouraged from joining the profession. It was a way to earn money, and a way to earn money often independently. But certainly they were not allowed to work in Southwark when the bishop was in town, and they were not allowed to wear certain kinds of clothing that respectable women wore. In other words, they had to be marked, and they had to be marked as different and presumably lesser, although that's a cultural and historical question. Still, they were accepted as subtenants of the church land, and by the 15th century, the manor issues quite an incredible document. This is the document. It's a 15th century document, although it claims to be an 11th century document, but we know it's a 15th century document, and lucky for me, it's in the Bodleian at Oxford, so I could photograph it and take it. And you can read it slowly. Item we ordain and make, I'm not sure what that following word is, but man nor woman about the time of, anyway, you can make out certain words, and certainly it's been translated and transcribed by historians extensively by this stage. So this document is quite incredible to anybody who's worked on the issue of prostitution in the contemporary world, or anybody who's worked on the issue of migration or trafficking in the contemporary world, because it is issued by the church and it details the rights and freedoms of the sex workers who worked in the diocese. It's a kind of code of conduct. And basically, prostitution is effectively legal. And significantly for anyone, as I've said, who works on migration in today's climate, their freedom of movement is expressly protected in this church document. So no brothel owner is allowed to keep a sex worker in his house against her wishes. This is quite an amazing story, the paradoxes and the layers here. And I can attest that after many months and years reading the secondary literature. I did a tiny bit of archival work, but literally, one day. And the secondary literature is vast. I mean, professional historians have been at this for centuries, so there was nothing I was going to discover that they hadn't already found. But having researched it for quite a few years, both the history of Southwark and the history of medieval prostitution, I can tell you that all of what I've said so far is true. the dating of this manuscript causes a little bit of a problem because it claims to be 400 years earlier than it's eventually found to be. But in fact, when I first heard this story, I couldn't believe it was true. And I asked a medieval history colleague of mine at St. Peter's College, I'm going to this ritual which says that medieval prostitutes practiced in the church land and were protected by the Church of England, but also not part of it. That sounds completely outlandish. She said, oh yes, it's totally attested. And for quite a few years she was handing me pamphlets about the demeanor of prostitutes in medieval France and various other relevant and interesting information. Now, the ritualists' argument is that although they were allowed to practice in Southwark, although the ritualists are allowed to practice in Southwark, but although the sex workers were allowed to practice in Southwark as well, the prostitutes were still treated as outcasts. This is a plausible claim, and the way the contemporary ritualists mobilize around this fact is to gather and commemorate. So it's the paradox they're interested in. On one hand, they are paying rent to the church. On the other hand, they're stigmatized. And it's this paradox that the ritual is trying to generate activist mobilization around. And the way they do this is to gather and commemorate what it means to be on the margins or periphery of the social order. The ritual is precisely about finding the connection between the medieval outcast sex worker and whatever contemporary excluded parts of societies we may find ourselves. It's a way to reclaim, as it were, the outcast from within. And indeed, most of the people who attend are artists, countercultural seekers, some former sex workers, some current sex workers, unionists, visionaries. In other words, people who are not primarily identified with mainstream capitalist culture, although importantly, they are welcome too. And lots of people walk by, and sometimes you'll have people in ties kind of coming home from work at 7 p.m. in what is now a very, pricey part of London because it's central. And the ritualists will say, you're welcome too, even though you've come from the city, you can still be part of us. This is part of the ethos of the place. It is specifically, in other words, a non-exclusionary gathering, and who does not, indeed, at times feel a little bit of an outcast? So part of the appeal of the ritual is its ability to speak to all humanity, quote unquote. That's what they call for. The ritual takes place by a set of gates, now called the memorial gates, surrounding a piece of land, now very valuable, but that was, in the 1990s, supposed to be transformed into an extension of the London Tube's Jubilee line, and later, after that was halted, into a corporate car park. During the early construction works, the city, however, found an unmarked graveyard that had clearly been used for impoverished women and children. And once the bones were found, of course, the London Tube project could not proceed, and several years later, the developers who tried to build the car park were also lobbied to stop on account of the lobbyists were largely the ritualists, arguing that the histories needed to be memorialized and could not simply be layered over with corporate needs. So thus did this scratchy little outpost become an appropriate site for a ritual designated to commemorate the, quote, outcast dead and the spirits of sex workers, whom we know were not treated as fully integrated members of society. And it's very recently, this is from 2017, been transformed into a memorial garden with volunteer efforts. Those years of activist lobbying on the part of the ritual group were finally successful. So here's where the history gets a little fuzzy, though. It turns out that the graveyard was established in the mid-18th century, not the medieval period, and the bones that were excavated date from the early 19th century. It's not a medieval graveyard. The skeletons that were found are not the skeletons of medieval prostitutes, and we do not, in fact, know the burial practices for women who were sex workers during their lifetimes before early modern London. So the idea that they would have been marked, as the ritualists claim, in, quote, an unmarked grave outside the gates of the cathedral, which this is an unmarked grave site outside the gates of the cathedral, but it doesn't date to the period of time that is the object of this ritual. So there's a kind of historical mismatch here. It's not all tallying up. So the story that this is where they were, and indeed, by the end of the 16th century, John Stowe, a famous Tudor chronicler, is talking about graveyards for prostitutes. He doesn't know where it is, but this is actually a myth that has gone on for several hundred years itself. So the claim of the ritual that this is the place for the medieval prostitutes is powerful, but it may not be true. Now, the ritualists' claims, these claims bothered my historian colleagues a lot when I would try and check this with, dutifully kind of going to the historians as I'm writing this book that's tacking between anthropology and history. I didn't want to do it without professional help. So I would report on the ritual and they would freak out, they're claiming that a Victorian graveyard is a medieval one. And indeed, they helped me look at the surveys and we could find when the graveyard was sort of when there was a graveyard and when there wasn't a graveyard, etc. Or, we do not know the burial practices for prostitutes and whether they were allowed in parish graveyards. And I, the anthropologist, found myself countering, and I will hold to this, in the realm of ritual, whether something is myth or history is not necessarily the most important consideration, because it is about, necessarily, constructing a narrative that speaks to us here and now. And I said this even though much of my own work for this book was about fact-checking the ritual narrative and being able to parse the historical truth from the mythical one, so as to be able to tell the anthropological story. And by the way, importantly, the ritualists themselves, who are reading all the history themselves and know a great deal about Southwark and a great deal about the Southwark history, as more and more of this history is uncovered and talked about over the course of the years of this research, the ritual claims that they were making also changed because they wanted to be true to the history even as they enjoyed creating the myth. There's nothing fixed about the ritual either. The point in this case is that the history that they are describing, that they are discussing, that they are mobilizing is being used for the sake of the present, as I tried to argue to my historian colleagues, speaking from the anthropological view. Part of the present is, of course, a continuity, as the ritualists explicitly argue. There have always been outcasts in society, and sex workers, who have never been fully accepted or integrated as respectable members in any society, are an excellent symbolic example. More locally, Southwark and London have been at odds for centuries. This is this is going to be recorded. Okay, I was going to say propaganda, but anyway, this is some self-promotion literature about Southwark, the borough of Southwark, and this is Shakespeare's Globe, right? Southwark and London have been at odds for centuries. In 1327, King Edward III wrote with an impassioned insistence about how the felons, the criminals in Southwark, required more stringent punishment. And Southwark actually only became formally incorporated into the City of London in 1965. Another continuity, the English love their language, their poems, their plays, and especially their Shakespeare. The main ritualist, John Constable, is a poet and playwright who writes in the long-loved medium of medieval mystery plays. Oh, that's him. Eccentricity and artistry go hand in hand, as they have for centuries in Great Britain, navigating the higher echelons of society with the renegade ones. In fact, John Constable, pictured here, went to Cambridge before he dropped out to travel the world and dabble with drugs, like the twists and turns of the River Thames. So these are the cultural continuities that researching this ritual taught me. There are layers and layers to this story, and we don't have so much time today, but like the land by which the ritual takes place. And some of those layers are the internal dynamics of the church, the Southwark Cathedral in this case, which recently formally apologized to the ritualists for its medieval treatment of sex workers, the increasing multiculturalism of London, and especially Southwark, the growing potency of graveyards as memorial sites. The narrative kept coming back to Southwark as a willing and welcoming location of alterity, and particularly to the ambiguous expansiveness of the church. Such a story, it was said to me frequently, could only happen in Southwark. In fact, in one of John's plays, The Southwark Mysteries, it was produced in a performance in the cathedral, much to my astonishment, given that I thought the whole point was an alterity in relation to the cathedral. and I asked one of the employees in the bookstore if it was strange that a play commemorating medieval sex workers and criticizing the church for it would take place inside the holy walls, inside a place of worship. "Yes, it's very unconventional," she said with pride, but it was also very Southwark. That was her response. So the response to my study, the response in England to my study of England, articulating England's past, was equally telling from the anthropological perspective. On one occasion, returning to Oxford from attending the ritual in London, I bumped into my head of department on the train, a renowned theologian, and still trying to make sense of what I was hearing and the multiple layers and the multiple contradictions that seemed to be exposed time and again by the story, I told him about the ritual event I had been to. I rather hoped he might help me contextualize the theology of it and the way the church, in fact, dealt with the sex workers, which seemed to me a critical problem. But he simply waved his hand and said, "That's the Church of England for you." I must admit this was like a red flag to an anthropological bull. What is it about the culture of Anglicanism that would give rise to a ritual that commemorates the people who were precisely excluded from the church? And only over time, the time involved in ethnographic learning, as we discussed last week, did I realize that the ideas of acceptance, of an unerring welcome, if sometimes hesitantly and almost always in a hierarchical fashion, are central to the notions of redemption, pity, and mercy in Church of England theology. These are some images that are in the garden today. So we have a series of continuities and a concomitant series of contradictions. But what was it about the early 21st century that brought about this ritual in this location in the first place? And I should say that I mentioned, and I have a lot of stories about people's responses as I was doing this research, which went on for quite a few years. And in a way, my favorite was when and it happened often, when people said, "Wow, a ritual has been going on since the medieval period." And I said, "No, the ritual's been going on since 2001, but it's commemorating the medieval period," and people's faces would fall. They would much rather a ritual that had been continuous for centuries. But I tried to convince them of the interest of that fact alone. So my question, of course, is what is it about 2001? What's happening at the turn of the 21st century? Where is the cultural disjuncture that would inspire this critical response after things basically lying dormant, in fact, for several hundred years? We've talked about the continuities, but where is the cultural disjuncture that would inspire this? And the answer, Max Weber would be proud. Capital. Indeed, he should be proud, having predicted in the most prescient comment of social science that capitalism would one day be loosed from its so-called iron cage. Just behind the ritual ground, London's newest, tallest building was being constructed over the course of the years that I was researching this ritual, the Shard. It is, in fact, the tallest building in Europe, and it was being constructed literally kind of over the ritual ground from 2009 to 2012. The Shard is widely hailed as an architectural triumph by famed architect Renzo Piano. It's 87 stories high, and I think still the tallest building in Europe. I don't think anybody's outdone it yet. And of course, and what I argue is that it's a sign of how transnational capital was taking over not only London, but even radical Southwark. The city could not finance the building alone, and the Qatari national government had to step in to pay for it. London's wealth, swallowing Southwark's poverty but not alleviating it, is therefore enabled by transnational finance, even as poor transnational migrants constitute the narrative core of every election fight for the past 2 decades, possibly longer, and possibly in the medieval period as well, because many of the sex workers were Flemish, by the way. A local, poor but proud borough that has long welcomed outcasts, some of whom were migrants themselves, in the on-the-ground and in-the-flesh trades of all kind, is being literally overshadowed by aspirations of global wealth and virtual finance. This is a dramatic disjuncture of character, one that could well bring about shamanic visions and activist rituals to draw attention to its plight. And the ritual, I argue, is precisely a fight against what Weber predicted would eventually be, quote, victorious capitalism, unquote. Are these incremental changes of scale or changes in kind? Only time will tell. Okay, little intermezzo, because I know those are both long sections and we still have a little bit to go. So I'm just going to give you a little brief conceptual, I know you're probably not in the mood for high theory at this point in the afternoon on a hot day, but I am sparing you a theoretical lecture that I could have written called Of Dialectics, Binaries, and Oscillation, Synchrony, and Diachrony. Don't worry, you're not going to get that. But I am going to give you just a tiny bit of theory on time, on the concept of time in general. Time, arguably the central concept in our discussions of history, and certainly the crux of a cultural worldview, as well as a powerful way of coming to know another culture, has taken a subtle, but I hope present role in my first two lectures. Last week, we discussed how extended fieldwork over time and through human porosity can enable becoming part of or integrated with another culture, or a culture that previously seemed foreign. Just as time immersed in a new or different context means that culture becomes part of you. We also touched on the oscillation between immersive participation and analytical observation in ethnography, which I've suggested, in fact, in the book on ritual, is indicative not only of ethnography, but also of human thought writ large, and is perhaps especially evident in ritual. And we can talk more about any of these things in the discussion if you would like, or subsequently. And in the first week of the series, I discussed the focus on early anthropology on the concept of the evolution of religion, and how primitives were thought to represent an earlier form of culture than moderns. This approach is, of course, widely and roundly and correctly critiqued now, but perhaps nowhere more so than in Johannes Fabian's famous book, Time and the Other, where he plainly states, quote, "It is by diagnosing anthropology's temporal discourse that one rediscovers the obvious, namely that there is no knowledge of the other capitalized, which is not also a temporal, historical, a political act," unquote. Fabian's argument is that by placing the other in a different temporal register, as we did so clearly in the early years of our discipline with evolutionism, we establish a distance and an alterity that is safe and that is unsurpassable. That is safe, I should say in quotation marks, right? Time is instrumentalized in these cases in order to make the other look behind us, or precisely, that is, to primitivize the other. And this is the opposite of what we try to do now, I hope, with contemporary ethnography, even as we try and get inside the time or the temporal worldview of the other. Hopefully we don't still construct others as such, although the question of alterity will always, in some sense, be with us as human beings. Contrary to what Fabian fears, we attempt to experience time as they, our others, do, as those with whom we are immersed do. Shocking as it is from the historical vantage point of evolutionist anthropology, we now move into their worlds rather than scoff at them for being unable to enter, or really prohibiting them from entering, ours. Time, used correctly, this is a musical event in the garden, is not a facilitator, but an antidote to alterity. It becomes a way of reformulating the self, allowing the other within, as we saw last week in Evans Pritchard's example of seeing the witchcraft. Ethnography depends on the reality that things change over time, as we hinted at in the discussion. We are constantly formed and reformed, and can thus be reformed in a new context, with new traces and new cultural knowledge. So in a sense, my fieldwork with this group of ritualists was the opposite of what Fabian warned us against in the pitting of time against the other. I was getting a historical lesson, and also being brought up to speed on the realities of English culture by my informants. I was the one who was out of date, or behind the times, and it was they who educated me on Southwark history, Church of England economies, and the paradoxes and contradictions of medieval sexual mores. They taught me how much the English loved their history, and the power of telling a story over and over again to create and to reflect cultural change. They'd provide us, now today, with an example of the ways symbolic narratives about time and history contribute to the construction of time and the present. That is, how our stories about the past are productive of our present. What seems a historical story or study is in fact a contemporary one. Such is the local tale of co-presence, co-temporality. But I also suggest we can think bigger than that. Rather than focusing only on a local story of a southern borough of London, let us see if anthropology can contribute to seeing global history as an overlapping intersecting, layered, nodal, dynamic set of multiple cultural genealogies. What do you say? What do you think? From below and from above, with as many sets of power relations, human encounters, psychic motivations, collective ideologies, and individual experiences as we can account for in all of them. Sounds like a good aspiration, maybe? Now, no one of us will be able to accomplish all of that. We will have to be content with what feminist philosophers of science call partial knowledge, what Donna Haraway calls partial knowledge. But perhaps some of the pieces of the pie can become accessible to an anthropology that is willing to take history seriously. Okay, last section. And I should warn you, in this last section, I'm talking about new work, so I could carry on forever, but I promise I won't carry on for more than 10 minutes, which will take us to the end of the time. Last section called Renouncing the World, second case study. And now, very firmly in the present, I want to move to one last case study to consider how our cultural categories, while seeming to stay static, can also be the objects of our study of cultural change. So this final section of the paper wraps up with a discussion of what I hope is another way that anthropologists may use and possibly contribute to the study of history, that is, the historicizing of conceptual categories that, like all categories in cultural life, come to be seen as natural. If Weber encouraged us to consider the historical adaptations of symbolic meanings or cultural terrains in particular communities or societies, in the Parsons School, some actually call this evolution, as in development or the historical sense. So if Weber encouraged that historical adaptations of symbolic meanings, and for us to consider how individuals can play a role in cultural and religious change, he wanted us also to recall how the categories themselves are in flux with real-world effects. This is actually a picture taken from the old research. This is at the gates, as you can see. But I wanted to include it because this flag is, of course, the flag of St. George. It's the English national flag. So in this spirit, I've just started a project, and you're not really supposed to talk about new work in lectures of this kind because you don't know the answers yet. So that's why I've given it 9 minutes. But I wanted to give you a sense of it, and indeed, if you have thoughts, please let me know them. So I've just started a new project called Renouncing the World, Hindu Politics and Ascetic Life in Independent India, about the concept of the Hindu nation as it has changed since independence in 1947. And this is me and my Baba, who I showed you last week. The picture from last week was 2016. I think this is taken in 2015. And you can see, I hope, the historical dimension of the project as embedded in a recent genealogy of the concept of the Hindu nation. I'm precisely suggesting that neither the term Hindu nor the term nation has remained static or stable in its meaning over the course of the past 72 years, let alone before that, but I just picked independence as the beginning, for reasons you may see. And I'm further suggesting that the ways these concepts, the concept of Hindu, the concept of religion, the concept of nation, have shifted are articulated both within, that is, internal to the Indian context, and perhaps especially in relation to India's vision of herself. First, in the context of a nationalized or renationalized world in the aftermath of World War II, which was a world that, in previously colonized parts of the world at least, was experiencing the first flush of independent nationhood in the 1950s and early 1960s. And then, arguably since the 70s, and especially since the 80s, in the context of a transnationalized or globalized world. So the project asks whether and how religion has come to be an increasingly prominent political tool since the independence of India, and why a category like religion, and specifically a category like Hinduism, would come to have the power and the mobilizing force that it does during this nascent national period in Indian history. India has had a strongly secular political constitution since 1950, and yet there has been a steady, if changing, at times prominent, at times marginal, movement that wishes to equate the Indian nation with Hindu religion specifically over the course of the lifetime of this proudly secular state, or what was a proudly secular state. But the configurations of Hindu nationalism, what is being argued for, what the goals are, what the putative reasons for the legitimacy of a Hindu nation are, and who the conceptual opposition is demographically and politically, have not remained constant. These are conceptual questions, then, as well as historical ones, about the categories and uses of religion, the categories and uses of nation and nationhood, the political deployment of each of these categories, and what inspires and promotes a certain vision or version of nationalist sentiment in relation to religious identity and practice. In short, they are anthropological questions about collective representations, national discourses, and the possibility or likelihood that international or global categories of identity, such as religion and nation, have changed in relation to each other in such a way that they play out in particular ways in particular places at specific times. What Hindu nationalism looked like in 1950 is not what it looks like in 2019, just as what being Hindu meant in 1950, when they in fact had to teach that category to Nepali census takers, is not what it means today. So historians of modern India have detailed the social trajectories of the independent state and analyzed the texts of nationalist thinkers. Political scientists have assessed public responses to a resurgent Hindu nationalism in the 21st century. But the aim here, what I can contribute to this complex story, is rather to offer ethnographic insight into the life history of an individual ascetic. Swami Rajeshwari Giri, born in 1937, now 81, known colloquially as Pagal Baba. And what I want to do is use the voice of Pagal Baba, an individual Indian ascetic whose lifetime has paralleled the development of independent India, to understand the motivations for joining the Hindu right wing, as Pagal Baba did as a young boy in the early 1940s, and to analyze what it has represented to him and to the nation over the course of a life that has been explicitly committed to Hindu ascetic practice since his initiation as a renouncer as a young man in the 1960s. It will be an oral history, if you like, using one individual's life story as a way into the larger tale of the Indian nation and the collective categories that have mobilized its dominant or public political movements over time. Renouncers are supposed to keep their natal personal histories to themselves. Their former selves are said to have died once they take initiation as renouncers. But in practice, people can and sometimes do speak about natal families or childhoods. Over time, as my friendship with Pagal Baba grew, and bear in mind I've been working with him since 1998, I learned more and more about his background. He was born in Kasauli, in what is now Himachal Pradesh, the eldest of 5 children. But I only discovered a very few years ago, when this picture was taken in 2014, that he was a lifelong member of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS, one of the most right-wing Hindu organizations in India, having joined as a young boy. The cognitive dissonance of this discovery, that such an open-minded, look at that smile, usually mild-mannered, worldly gentleman who was also a dear friend, was a member of a far-right nationalist, what I call nationalist, he disputes that, but was a far-right group, inspired this project. And so I'm asking, what did it mean to him at different stages of his life to be a member of the RSS? This is a picture from the RSS website. You get the picture, I think. Certainly, Pagal Baba was inspired by his boyhood affiliation, which was the organization was founded in 1925, and it was always known for its right-wing Hindu views, although he was not aware of its explicitly political goals at the time as a little boy. In fact, he joined a youth brigade, which was modeled after the Nazi Party's youth brigade brown shirts in the early 1940s. The RSS offered exercise classes to young boys in the public square, and he was glad to join in. It was a way to get a little bit of a workout with his youthful energy and in the company of his friends in the mountain air before school. Perhaps because he could be a little rambunctious or defiant, he was smart and he didn't mind challenging his teachers, which was not always welcomed in Indian school system. He liked both the physical and the mental discipline that the Sangh offered. Baba was 9 years old when India was granted independence in 1947 and had just turned 10 when Mahatma Gandhi was shot in early 1948 by a former member of the RSS. This is Gandhi and Nehru, just just before he died, I believe, because these are pictures taken by Henri Cartier-Bresson, the wonderful French photographer who was with him just before he died and who was able to capture images of the funeral just before Mahatma Gandhi died, just before he was assassinated. So Baba was 10 when Gandhi was shot by a former member of the RSS, which was the organization to which he belonged as a proud youth member. He felt the blow both at home and in public. His mother stopped cooking in mourning, but his own RSS youth troop was banned, its members rounded up and threatened with prison sentences. These are pictures from the collective mourning that took place after Gandhi's assassination. This double wound, wrongful accusation for the assassination of a leader he loved, laid the ground for an insult he often recalls today, that his own organization was implicated, he still claims wrongfully implicated, in the murder of his own national hero, established deep mistrust in both the public representation of political events and what he perceived as the political misrepresentation of what he experienced as the RSS's genuine and, to him, innocuous support of Hindu youth. That's the beginning of his life story. The project itself will continue through his 81 years. Those are his political views, his right-wing affiliations, but they're not limited, of course, to his own experience. He is still a life member of the RSS, as dismissive as he remains about party politics. And he's neither an outlier nor entirely representative. There will be as many experiences of the Hindu nation as there are individuals, as we know since Weber. But he may be indicative of something larger than himself too, including a set of ideologies that are rooted in time. So I will not prolong his life history now and these changing cultural categories, but I think you can see I have my work cut out for me as I pursue the historical path to tracing the pasts and the futures of cultural flows and the global and local modes of thought we hold within them. Bhagavad Baba is delighted with Modi's re-election. And in the 20 years even of my own research, I've seen a general tendency for ascetics to refuse to engage in political worldly affairs, to an ascetic chief minister of Uttar Pradesh and a prime minister proudly upheld and referred to as the Sadhu Raj, the Sadhu or renouncer king or government. So this will keep me occupied over the next year, and I hope it's a little snapshot, as it were, of an example of how the times and the categories, to adapt the Bob Dylan song, keep on a-changing. Thank you.